An elderly man with Alzheimer's welcomed a stray Pitbull into his home, and what unfolded next will touch your heart like never before. The morning light filtered softly through the kitchen window, casting a warm glow over the worn countertops and faded tiles. Javier, moving with the practiced ease of routine, filled the air with the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee. The small kitchen was quiet except for the occasional clatter of dishes and the soft hum of the coffee maker. A sudden crash interrupted the rhythm. Javier spun around to see his father, Ernesto, standing in the doorway, trembling hands clutching the remnants of a coffee cup, shards scattered on the tiled floor. "Papa, it's okay," Javier said, his voice calm despite the tightness in his chest. He crouched, swiftly collecting the broken pieces. Ernesto stood frozen, confusion clouding his pale blue eyes. I didn't mean to," Ernesto murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Javier glanced up, offering a reassuring smile. "I know. Don't worry about it. Let me clean this up." With practiced efficiency, Javier tidied the mess and resumed his task, placing a plate of buttered toast and a fresh cup of coffee on the table. The comforting sense of breakfast filled the air, a small attempt to bring normalcy to their fractured mornings. "Where's your mother?" Ernesto asked suddenly, his tone curious yet distant as he settled into his chair. Javier stilled for a moment, his hand hovering over the coffee pot. The question was as familiar as the sound of the clock ticking on the wall. Yet it never stopped stinging. "She's not here, Papa," Javier replied gently, his words carrying the weight of repetition. Ernesto frowned, his gaze drifting around the room as if searching for something tangible to anchor him. "Did she go to the market? She should be back by now." Javier set the pot down, inhaling deeply to steady himself. "No, Papa. Mama passed away years ago." The statement lingered in the air, heavy and unwelcome. Ernesto's brows knitted together as he absorbed the words, a flicker of pain crossing his face before his expression reset. A blank slate once more. "Oh, I see," he muttered, though the clarity was fleeting. Moments later, his eyes lit up with the same spark of confusion. "But where is she now?" Javier clenched his jaw, his grip tightening around the edge of the counter. Yet when he turned back to face his father, all he allowed to surface was patience. "Drink your coffee, Papa. It's getting cold." The toast and coffee sat untouched for a while before Ernesto finally picked up the cup with trembling hands. His gaze softened, a faint smile curling at the corners of his lips. "You're always so attentive," Ernesto said, his voice warm with affection. "Thank you, mijo." Javier's heart clenched at the simple phrase. It was the same thing his father used to say when he was a boy, coming home from school to find a plate of cookies waiting for him on the kitchen table. The familiarity of it now, uttered by a man who seemed so far removed from the father he once knew, was both comforting and devastating. He turned toward the sink, pretending to scrub an already clean plate, giving himself a moment to gather his emotions. Tears pricked his eyes, but he blinked them away, unwilling to let the cracks show. After breakfast, Javier found himself staring out the kitchen window. The garden, once vibrant and meticulously maintained by his mother, had become a shadow of its former self. Wilted plants and overgrown weeds filled the space where roses once bloomed in full glory. The iron gate at the far end was rusted, its once straight bars now bent and crooked. The house, like its occupants, was caught in a state of decay, a place where time seemed to stand still while also slipping through their fingers. Javier sighed, rubbing the back of his neck as a wave of weariness settled over him. There was so much to do, so much to fix, yet the weight of his father's care left little room for anything else. Every moment was spoken for, tied to a routine that revolved around Ernesto's needs. "Javier," Ernesto called from the table, his voice pulling Javier from his thought. "Yes, Papa, thank you for everything," Ernesto said simply, his eyes locking onto Javier's with a rare moment of lucidity. Javier swallowed hard, nodding. "Always, Papa." As the day moved forward, the silence between them grew, punctuated only by the occasional question or fragmented memory. And yet, despite the monotony and the heartache, Javier knew he wouldn't have it any other way. This was his father, and no matter how broken the days became, he would hold them together for as long as he could. Javier gave his father a steady yet kind look. "Stay inside the house, okay? I'll be back soon." Ernesto nodded absently, his fingers tracing the outline of a photograph of his late wife. Javier paused for a moment, his chest tightening with a mix of worry and guilt as he watched the frail man. Then, with a deep breath, he stepped out, closing the door softly behind him, leaving Ernesto alone in a house filled with hazy memories. The hours trickled by, marked only by the soft shuffle of Ernesto's footsteps echoing through the quiet home. He wandered aimlessly from room to room, his movements slow and deliberate until an inexplicable restlessness stirred him. Eventually, it guided him outside into the garden. The late afternoon sun cast warm rays on his weathered skin as he made his way down the small stone path. His gaze wandered, unfocused, until something at the gate caught his attention. Perhaps it was a sound or a subtle movement. He couldn't quite tell. Drawn toward the gate, he moved with a deliberation that seemed almost foreign to him. When he reached it, he stopped, narrowing his eyes against the sun's glare. The wind whispered through the iron bars, making them creak faintly, but it wasn't the sound that had pulled him there. Beyond the gate stood a large dog, a muscular animal with a white coat dappled with brown patches. The creature remained motionless, its amber eyes locked on Ernesto with an intensity that made the old man shiver. The dog's posture was rigid, alert, and its gaze seemed to study Ernesto's every move. A faint growl rumbled in its throat, not loud, but enough to send Ernesto's heart racing. He froze, his hands trembling at his sides as he stared back at the animal. There was something unnerving about the dog, yet he couldn't look away. Fear coursed through him, but so did a strange fascination. The chilly breeze rustled the branches overhead, making the moment feel alive with quiet tension. Almost unconsciously, Ernesto's thin, unsteady hand reached out, brushing against the cold, rusted lock on the gate. His fingers curled around it, the metal rough beneath his touch. He hesitated, his breath shallow, as the sound of the lock creaking filled the otherwise silent garden. For a moment, he remained frozen, his aged eyes locked on the dog beyond the gate. The animal hadn't moved, but its piercing stare seemed to penetrate every foggy thought in Ernesto's mind. Another shiver ran down his spine as the wind nudged the gate, causing it to groan softly, as though warning him of what was to come. Swallowing hard, Ernesto began to turn the lock. The sharp click of the latch seemed unnaturally loud, and the dog tilted its head slightly at the sound, its ears perking up. Ernesto exhaled shakily, gripping the edge of the gate for support as he pushed it open. The metal hinges screeched in protest, breaking the stillness of the moment. The dog stepped forward cautiously, its movements deliberate and measured. Ernesto instinctively took a step back, his hand bracing against the gatepost for balance. The distance between them shrank, though the seconds stretched endlessly. The animal lifted its nose to the air, sniffing with slow deliberation as a deep, resonant growl emanated from its throat. Ernesto stood frozen, his back straight and hands trembling at his sides. Despite the confusion clouding his thoughts, the dog's presence held him captive. He was afraid, yes, but there was also a peculiar calm in knowing that the creature seemed to be weighing its actions, not acting on impulse. "Who are you?" Ernesto murmured softly, his voice barely audible over the sound of the wind. His question was not meant to be answered, yet it hung in the air, filled with an almost childlike wonder. The dog inched closer, its eyes unblinking and steady. Ernesto's pulse quickened, but he didn't move. Something unspoken passed between them, a silent understanding that neither would act rashly. The dog's growl subsided slightly, replaced by a tense, watchful silence. For reasons he couldn't explain, Ernesto felt a faint glimmer of trust in the presence of the mysterious animal. Fear lingered, but it no longer consumed him. As the dog took one final step forward, the late afternoon light bathed them both, illuminating the fragile balance of caution and connection that tethered them in that moment. "Easy there. I'm not here to hurt you," Ernesto said softly, his voice barely more than a murmur. The dog tilted its head slightly, its ears twitching forward and then back, as though trying to make sense of the words. Taking another cautious step, the animal crossed the threshold of the gate completely. Ernesto held his breath. Up close, the dog was even larger than he'd thought, its muscular frame and white coat dappled with brown patches gleaming in the warm light of the setting sun. The growling stopped abruptly, and the dog stood still, its sharp eyes fixed on Ernesto. That was when Ernesto noticed something, a glimmer in those eyes that wasn't aggression, but a mixture of alertness and, perhaps, curiosity. The dog dipped its head slightly, then stepped closer. Ernesto didn't move. They locked eyes, caught in a strange, frozen moment. The air between them seemed heavy with unspoken tension, but there was an undeniable, wordless understanding. Suddenly, the dog turned its head sharply, as if hearing something in the distance, and broke eye contact. Without warning, it started walking briskly into the yard, moving past Ernesto without even brushing against him. "Where are you going?" Ernesto called after it, his voice tinged with both confusion and intrigue. He pivoted slowly, leaning against the gate for support, and watched as the dog moved gracefully, its body taut with purpose. Near the edge of the stone path, the dog stopped and sniffed the air again, its posture rigid. Ernesto felt his heart pound against his ribs. There was something unusual about the way the animal acted, like it was searching for something. A sudden bark shattered the stillness, and Ernesto flinched, the sound reverberating through the calm evening air. The dog barked again, louder this time, before darting toward the back of the yard, disappearing behind a thick cluster of shrubs. Ernesto frowned, a mix of confusion and unease tugging at him. There was something unsettling about the urgency in those barks. He turned toward the gate, double-checking to ensure it was securely latched, then started moving cautiously in the direction the dog had gone. Each step felt deliberate, his old frame heavy as his shoes crunched against the dry leaves scattered across the stone path. As he advanced, the barking grew louder, more insistent, and Ernesto's unease deepened. Then, beneath the echo of the dog's calls, he caught something else, a faint sound that made him stop in his tracks. Tilting his head slightly, he listened harder. Voices. They were faint, almost whispers, but distinctly human. Ernesto stood frozen, his mind racing to make sense of the muffled words. The voices seemed to come from the far end of the yard, exactly where the dog had disappeared. "Who's out there?" he murmured to himself, though he knew no one could hear him. A gust of wind swept through the yard, rustling the branches of the trees and carrying fragmented pieces of the voices closer. Ernesto hesitated, but couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to know what was happening in his own backyard. He took another tentative step, then another, his frail body pressing forward despite the growing weight of uncertainty. The leaves continued to crunch beneath his feet as he followed the trail toward the source of the sounds. The dog's barking intensified, echoing off the trees and into the darkening evening. Ernesto's pulse quickened, a strange mix of fear and determination driving him. Just as he neared the shrubs where the dog had vanished, he paused again. Between the sharp bursts of barking, the voices became clearer. They weren't random murmurs. They were deliberate, hushed exchanges. "Who's there?" Ernesto's voice was louder this time, though it still trembled with hesitation. The wind stirred again, shaking the leaves and scattering the words into incomprehensible fragments. Ernesto felt a chill creep up his spine, but his feet kept moving forward, one step at a time. He didn't understand what was happening, but a deep, instinctual pull urged him onward. Though he didn't know what awaited him beyond the bushes, Ernesto knew he couldn't turn back now. Something, or someone, was in his yard, and he had to find out why. The dog's barking grew sharper, each sound cutting through the air like a warning siren. Ernesto quickened his pace, an uneasy blend of fear and resolve driving him forward. Questions churned in his mind. Who were these men? Why were they here? And what exactly was Leon, the dog, doing? Reaching the backyard, Ernesto steadied himself against the doorframe, his movements slow and unsteady. The golden hues of the setting sun filtered through the trees, casting long, wavering shadows over the unkempt grass. In the distance, Leon's deep, ferocious barks reverberated, breaking the silence and amplifying the tension that hung heavy in the air. Ernesto squinted, trying to make sense of the scene ahead. Leon stood rigid in the middle of the yard, his fur bristling like a soldier's armor. His amber eyes burned with a fierce mix of determination and anger, locked on two figures partially obscured by the shrubbery. The men, dressed in dark clothing with backpacks slung over their shoulders, froze under the dog's piercing gaze. One held a metal rod, while the other crouched low, rummaging through a bag of tools. "What? What are you doing here?" Ernesto tried to shout, but his voice came out in a fragile, trembling whisper. His throat felt constricted, his age and frailty betraying the authority he desperately wanted to convey. One of the men snapped his head around at the sound, his expression shifting between surprise and irritation. "Get back inside, old man. This doesn't concern you," he growled, his tone edged with a feigned intimidation. Leon let out a low, menacing growl in response, his posture shifting as he prepared to strike. The guttural sound sent the second man stumbling back a step, his confidence faltering. Then, without warning, Leon surged forward, his movements swift and predatory. The man with the metal rod barely had time to react. He raised the makeshift weapon, but Leon lunged with remarkable force, knocking him to the ground in a brutal collision. The man screamed as Leon's powerful jaws clamped down on his arm, pinning him in place, his yells mixed with Leon's relentless barking, creating a chaotic symphony of desperation and defiance. Seeing his partner incapacitated, the second man yanked a knife from his bag and turned toward Ernesto, his movements quick and deliberate. "Don't move," he barked, brandishing the blade as he advanced. Ernesto's legs wavered beneath him, the weight of fear almost overwhelming. His mind felt muddled, a haze of panic clouding his thoughts. Yet something deep within told him he couldn't remain passive. His eyes darted around the yard, seeking anything he could use to defend himself. Against the wall of the house, a sturdy piece of wood leaned precariously. Summoning what little strength he had, Ernesto shuffled over and gripped the plank, his hands trembling but determined. Meanwhile, Leon, still subduing the first intruder, paused momentarily, his sharp ears catching the sound of the knife slicing through the air. The second man moved closer to Ernesto, his intention clear: to use the elderly man as leverage. "Stay back!" the man shouted, his voice tinged with fear despite his aggressive stance. Ernesto tightened his grip on the wooden plank, holding it in front of him like a makeshift weapon. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat reminding him of the thin line he was walking between courage and desperation. "No," Ernesto said quietly, his voice steady for the first time. The intruder hesitated, unnerved by the unexpected defiance. It was enough. Leon, sensing the shift, released the first man and leapt again, his movements a blur. The knife-wielding intruder barely had time to react before Leon was upon him, his sharp bark echoing as he forced the man to retreat. As Ernesto stood in the dim light of the yard, his trembling hands clutching a piece of broken wood for protection, his voice rang out, surprisingly steady. "Don't come any closer." His eyes locked on the intruders, conveying a determination that defied his frail appearance. Leon, the massive dog that had been quietly watching, sprang into action. He released the first man, who crumpled to the ground, clutching his arm in pain. With startling speed, Leon lunged at the second intruder. The man barely had time to react before the dog's full weight hit him. His knife clattered to the ground, the metallic clang cutting through the tense silence. Scrambling to escape, the man stumbled toward the back wall, but Leon was relentless. The dog's powerful legs launched him forward, and within moments he caught the man by the leg as he attempted to climb. A guttural snarl reverberated as Leon dragged him down, pinning him to the ground. The man cried out in agony, struggling to free himself, but Leon's grip was unyielding. Nearby, Ernesto's energy seemed to drain all at once. The makeshift weapon slipped from his hands as he dropped to his knees, his breath coming in heavy, labored gasps. His eyes stayed fixed on the scene before him, a mixture of fear, awe, and gratitude clouding his expression. Leon, ever vigilant, remained poised over the subdued intruder. His growl rumbled low, a warning to anyone who might dare make a move. The first man continued to write on the ground, clutching his injured arm. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The only sounds were the shallow breaths of Ernesto and the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. The spell was broken by the sound of keys jangling and the back door slamming open. Javier rushed into the yard, his face pale with panic as his eyes darted across the chaotic scene. Spotting Ernesto kneeling in the dirt and Leon standing guard over the two men, his heart pounded harder. "Dad!" Javier shouted, sprinting to his father's side. He knelt beside Ernesto, gripping his shoulders and scanning him for injuries. Relief and confusion warred within him as he tried to process what he was seeing. Leon turned his head toward Javier, his intense gaze devoid of aggression, but filled with unwavering resolve. Javier swallowed hard, momentarily at a loss for words. All he could do was hold his father close and silently marvel at the dog that had somehow defended everything he held dear. Still shaken, Javier reached into his pocket and fumbled for his phone. His hands trembled as he dialed 911. "I need immediate assistance," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "Two men tried to break into my house. They're restrained in the backyard, but my dog is keeping them pinned." The operator assured him that officers were en route. Javier hung up, exhaling a shaky breath as he turned back to Ernesto. "Dad, are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer now. He noticed the dirt smeared across Ernesto's knees and the dazed look on his face. Ernesto met his gaze, his voice faint but clear. "The dog. He saved us. He was protecting us." Javier bit the inside of his cheek, his eyes shifting to Leon, who remained alert, his gaze fixed on the intruders. The low growl emanating from his throat was a constant reminder that he was ready to act again if needed. In the distance, sirens wailed, their sound growing louder as they approached. Ernesto flinched, his gaze darting toward the source of the noise. Javier quickly moved to the back gate, unlocking it to allow the police in. Within moments, officers entered the yard, guns drawn as they took in the scene before them. One of the intruders raised his uninjured hand in surrender, whining about his arm. The other mumbled incoherently, still pinned under Leon's watchful presence. "Stand down, everyone," one officer commanded, stepping cautiously toward the dog. Javier held up a hand. "He's not a threat to you. He's just protecting us." The officers exchanged glances, and one of them cautiously approached Leon. The dog's intense eyes shifted to the officer, but he didn't move. Javier stepped closer, his voice calm but firm. "Leon, it's okay. Let go." The dog hesitated for a moment before releasing his grip on the intruder's leg. Leon backed away slowly, positioning himself near Ernesto as though still guarding him. The officers quickly secured the intruders, snapping handcuffs onto their wrists. One of them approached Ernesto to take his statement, but the elderly man's words came out fragmented and confused. Seeing his father struggle, Javier stepped in to explain what had happened, all while keeping a wary eye on Leon. As the officers led the men away, Javier helped Ernesto to his feet and guided him toward a chair near the back door. Leon followed, sitting close by, his presence a silent but steadfast reassurance. Javier knelt beside his father, placing a hand on his shoulder. "It's over now, Dad," he said softly. Ernesto nodded faintly, his eyes drifting to Leon. That dog. He was a miracle. Javier couldn't bring himself to disagree. Ernesto's hand hovered in midair, moving back and forth as if he were stroking something invisible. "They were there, by the wall, and the dog. He saved us," he murmured, his voice trembling but filled with conviction. His eyes, distant yet vivid, seemed to replay the memory. A nearby officer shot Javier a skeptical look, one eyebrow arched. "He's not doing too well," Javier explained, his tone a mix of apology and exhaustion. "But what he's saying, it's true. This dog stopped them before they could do whatever they had planned." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the yard in dusky shadows, the officers escorted the would-be thieves away, leaving behind an eerie stillness. Javier stepped out into the backyard, carefully closing the gate behind him. His gaze landed on Ernesto, who remained crouched, gently running his hands through the snowy fur of Leon, the dog who had appeared just in time. For a moment, Javier paused, the sight of his father and the dog creating an ache in his chest. "Thank you," Ernesto whispered, his fingers trembling as they combed through Leon's fur. His voice cracked with gratitude, each word tender and raw. Leon, ever calm, sat still, as if absorbing every word. The fierceness he'd displayed earlier was now replaced by an almost regal serenity, his bright eyes fixed on Ernesto. Javier stood in the doorway, arms crossed, leaning against the frame. Relief washed over him. They had been spared something unthinkable. Yet beneath that relief lay guilt for leaving his father alone, and an unexpected admiration for the dog who had done more in one night than Javier had managed in years of care. That night, after ensuring Ernesto was tucked in bed and cleaning up the backyard, Javier settled at the kitchen table. His phone lay in his hand, the faint glow illuminating his furrowed brow. Determined, he searched for any trace of Leon's past. He uploaded a photo of the dog to local community pages and social media groups, describing briefly what had happened and asking if anyone recognized him. He contacted nearby animal shelters and veterinarians, leaving his contact information in case someone came forward to claim the dog. Days passed. Each one met with silence. No calls, no messages. No one seemed to be looking for Leon. Sitting at the same kitchen table late one evening, Javier scrolled through his phone again, only to glance up at the sound of soft breathing. In the living room, Ernesto was fast asleep, his face unusually peaceful. Leon lay nearby, his head resting on his paws, watching over the old man like a sentinel. Javier sighed, placing the phone down. His thoughts drifted, and a strange shift began within him. The idea of Leon staying no longer seemed absurd. In fact, it started to feel right. One evening, Javier nursed a mug of coffee, his fingers tracing the rim of the cup as his thoughts swirled. Leon was sprawled near the hallway, occasionally lifting his head to glance at Javier as if sensing the weight of his deliberations. Javier finally pushed himself to his feet and walked to the couch where Ernesto slept. His father's face relaxed in a way that was becoming rare. Leon immediately stood, alert and ready, waiting for some unspoken cue. Javier studied him for a long moment, then knelt to his level. "All right, Leon," he murmured, his voice low and almost unsure, as though he were confessing something to himself. "You should stay with us. I think you belong here." The words hung in the quiet room, an unspoken promise. Leon's ears twitched, and for a moment it seemed as if he understood. The next morning, Javier sat across from Ernesto in the living room. Leon rested by their feet, his presence grounding them both. Ernesto appeared more aware that day, his hands idly tracing the edge of the tablecloth as he studied his son's face. "Dad, there's something I need to talk to you about," Javier began, his tone steady but soft. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. Ernesto tilted his head slightly, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "I think Leon should stay with us," Javier said. His words were measured, careful, as if trying not to upset the fragile calm between them. Ernesto's gaze shifted to the dog at his feet, then back to his son. A small, knowing smile played at the corners of his lips. "He's a good boy," Ernesto said quietly, reaching down to stroke Leon's fur. And in that simple moment, Javier felt something inside him settle. For the first time in a long time, the house didn't feel quite so empty. "I think it's for the best." For a brief moment, Ernesto appeared lost in his own thoughts, but then, with a rare spark of clarity, he looked up at Leon and smiled. "He's a good protector, our guardian," he said, his voice carrying a conviction Javier hadn't heard in years. Ernesto's words struck a chord in Javier, a lump forming in his throat as he turned away to keep himself composed. "Yes, Dad," he murmured. "That's exactly what he is." From that moment on, Leon became an official part of their family. His presence began to shift the dynamics of the house in ways Javier hadn't foreseen. Ernesto, who often spent his mornings slumped in his armchair staring at nothing, started rising early to go outside with Leon. They'd stroll together down the stone path in the backyard, Ernesto gesturing with his hands as if telling the dog stories, while Leon trotted beside him, occasionally glancing up as though he understood every word. Javier would watch them from the kitchen window, a mixture of wonder and affection warming his chest. Seeing his father move with a newfound energy, even within the fog of his confusion, brought Javier a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, as Ernesto tended to the garden, something unexpected caught Javier's eye. Leon positioned himself near the old iron gate, standing firm as though sensing its weakness. Every time Ernesto wandered too close to the rusted bars, Leon would gently block his path, using his body as a barrier. "What are you up to, Leon?" Ernesto chuckled, trying to sidestep the dog. But Leon didn't budge, his calm gaze steady, his wagging tail almost as if to say, "That's far enough." With a shrug and a soft laugh, Ernesto turned back to the flowers, continuing his watering as Leon watched over him like a silent sentinel. Later that evening, while Javier was finishing the dishes, a faint noise drew his attention. He rushed into the kitchen to find Leon sitting squarely in front of the stove, his eyes fixed on a pot that had been left simmering unattended. Ernesto stood nearby, a look of mild confusion etched on his face. "Dad, what's going on?" Javier asked, swiftly turning off the burner. I think I was cooking something," Ernesto replied, his uncertainty cutting through Javier like a knife. Closing his eyes for a moment, Javier fought to keep his frustration in check. Then his gaze landed on Leon, still sitting in his spot, watching the pot like a vigilant guardian. Javier crouched down, placing a hand on the dog's head. "Thank you, Leon. You're saving us in ways I can't even begin to explain." As the days went by, Javier found himself relying more and more on Leon. When he left for work, the anxiety that usually gnawed at him began to fade. He knew Leon would be there, silently watching over Ernesto, protecting him in ways that eased Javier's constant worry. The bond between the three of them deepened, growing into something so natural it felt as though Leon had always been a part of their lives. One particularly long day, Javier walked through the living room to check on things before heading to bed. Ernesto was dozing on the couch, a blanket draped over his legs, his face peaceful for once. Leon, their dog, lay sprawled on the floor beside Ernesto's couch, his head resting near the elderly man's frail hands. In his sleep, Ernesto's fingers brushed gently against Leon's fur. The dog didn't flinch, remaining perfectly still, as if he instinctively knew how much that unconscious gesture meant. Javier leaned against the doorway, watching with a fullness in his heart he hadn't felt in years. For the first time, it seemed like their house had regained its soul. The soft morning sunlight streamed through the trees outside, painting the living room in golden hues. Leon darted joyfully through the garden, his tail wagging like a metronome of happiness, while Ernesto sat nearby in a sturdy outdoor chair, hands resting lightly on a cane he barely used. Javier stood by the porch, a mug of steaming coffee in hand, quietly observing the moment with a calm smile. The arrival of Leon had transformed their lives. The dog had not only saved Ernesto during a critical moment, but had seamlessly become an irreplaceable part of their family. For Ernesto, Leon brought back something Javier had thought long gone, a sense of purpose. For Javier, the weight on his chest had lightened. The guilt he had carried for years, for not being able to always be by his father's side, had softened into gratitude. Leon had filled a void that Javier's efforts alone could not. Knowing his father was in good company, he could focus on his work without the constant ache of worry. One afternoon, while they were all gathered in the living room, Ernesto surprised Javier by reciting a poem. His voice, though fragile, carried a passion that hinted at the man he used to be when he taught literature. "Life is a dream, and dreams themselves are only dreams," Ernesto said, his eyes glinting with a rare clarity. Javier, startled, set down the book he had been flipping through. "Dad, you remember that?" he asked, his throat tightening with emotion. Ernesto nodded slowly, a faint smile gracing his lips. "I always said it in class, so my students would understand how fleeting everything is." Javier couldn't speak right away, the moment weighing heavily on him. Leon, as if sensing the Ernesto stroked the dog's fur with deliberate tenderness, and Javier felt something deep within him both break and heal in the same breath. The days that followed were filled with small, unexpected joys. Javier found himself organizing a family meal in the garden, a gathering he had avoided for years, fearing his father's condition would make it too difficult. But with Leon around, everything felt more manageable. One peaceful afternoon, as the sun dipped low, the three of them sat together in the garden. Leon lounged by Ernesto's feet, content and watchful, while Javier leafed through a journal he had started, documenting the changes Leon had brought to their lives. On the final page, Javier wrote a simple sentence that captured it all. Leon wasn't just a protector. He saved us from ourselves. Closing the journal, Javier looked up at his father and the loyal dog by his side. For the first time in what felt like forever, a profound sense of completeness settled over him. Thank you for joining us on this heartfelt journey. Leon wasn't just a protector for Ernesto and Javier. He became the glue that mended a broken home, the light that brought warmth to a fading life, and the reminder that sometimes salvation comes in the form of unconditional love. If this story moved you as much as it did us, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with someone who might need a little hope today, and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart and inspire the soul. And, as always, remember, love and connection have the power to heal even the deepest wounds. See you in the next story.